Each day on Twitter, there is one main character. The goal is to never be it.
So this tweet is like 2 years old at this point, but it really put a name to something that seems like it's the website's core feature. Somebody will tweet something, maybe it's bizarre, maybe it's kind of ridiculous, maybe it's offensive. It'll go viral, and then it seems like everybody on Twitter brigades them. Our main character over this past weekend was somebody that people are calling Bean Dad, which it sounds pretty stupid, but this is a pretty regular occurrence for Twitter. A daily one, if not multiple times a day. But these main character events don't always involve big scandals. So, what does this have to say about your website, and how can somebody like Bean Dad only exist on a website that is floundering? Let's get into it. Before I get into the real meat of this, I want to talk about some of the biggest characteristics that you're going to see on websites that are on their 8th life. In spite of this being the first video on my channel, I have been on the internet for a long time. Like, an embarrassingly long time at this point, but whatever. There are a ton of similarities you'll notice when a website is starting to decline and atrophize. The first one would be power dynamics. In other words, a handful of popular users will dominate the discussions and the culture of a website, and like to an overwhelming extent, which is sort of an inevitability, but it tends to lead to harassment and elitism. When you have a select few people who are influencing everybody and everyone else for the most part seems really angry and really itching to jump down someone else's throat, you're gonna notice the communication and the platform getting a lot more indirect to avoid getting the brunt of this. You're also gonna see something similar to Eternal September, even if a website hasn't necessarily had a mass influx of new users. In other words, the website doesn't have any internal cultural memory anymore. It may as well have been flooded by newbies. It's not like it would have made that much of a difference. That and the platform becomes way too meta. Most of the discussions that are taking place on the website are about the website itself, the way it functions, and the communities within it, instead of, like, the actual intended purpose that it was meant to be used for. Another big thing here is terrible moderation, which will make it harder for people to sniff out what is and isn't genuine. The users, topics discussed, engagements. When your website is such a free-for-all, it's really difficult to gauge whether or not this stuff is authentic. And this is naturally gonna lead people to vigilante justice. In absence of proper moderators, the users will take on these roles themselves, just in response to all the harassment, bad behavior, and fake content, but usually this just makes things worse. And yeah, all of this stuff is present on the majority of social media platforms to an extent. Like on YouTube, you'll see it, especially where it concerns moderation issues and, you know, meta discussion. We all know there are entire channels dedicated to just discussing gossip between users and reacting to other people's content. You have power users, you have harassment, you have people who are trying to deliver accountability when they feel as though that hasn't happened, and you definitely have a lack of internal cultural memory. The thing you want to consider here is saturation. So whether or not the presence of these things completely dictates your experience on the website. As for YouTube, it's diverse and fragmented enough that you can use the site as intended and not really be involved in any of that. Twitter, on the other hand, is an entirely different animal. Obviously, account verification creates that class structure. The daily main character idea speaks to the scope of the harassment that takes place there. The tendency to dig up old pre-2014 tweets on whoever made you mad that day just kind of speaks to ignorance of the social mores on the site back then. It's not to say that this is inherently harmless or it wasn't reflective of social problems, but this was as commonplace as it was back then. But it is important context to consider. When we're talking about a one-off joke from nearly a decade ago, we can probably infer that this was edgy clout chasing and not a real reflection of the person's beliefs or the intentions that they have for their platform. The density of meta content on Twitter makes it just about as impenetrable as Reddit in 2016, Tumblr in 2015, 4chan in 2013, and the likes. The moderation is notoriously automated, robotic, and ineffective, to the point where Twitter has actually gotten a lot of backlash over it. And the users, as a consequence, are pretty much left to their own devices, which begets the trial by fire antics we see there pretty much all the time. But what makes Twitter a really strange and special case is that it really isn't your average website in terms of who's using it. Because in addition to your average Joe, you also have journalists, academics, politicians, actors, and all kinds of public figures who are right in the middle of this. And we're forced to take everything that happens there a little bit more seriously because there is a lot more at stake than just some random goon on something awful building a wildly unsafe zipline. A lot of people like to kick around what-if questions when it comes to dead websites, MySpace being the most common subject of this thought exercise, like, what if it beat Facebook? What if it actually turned into a functional music hosting platform? But the question we're asking today is, what if MySpace didn't die, but also didn't fix any of its issues, and was also the most important website in the world? Welp, that's how you get Bean Dad. In case you missed it, over the weekend, a Seattle-based musician named John Roderick tweeted a thread about how he very poorly taught his 9-year-old daughter to use a can opener with no assistance on his part. Per his Twitter thread, it took her 6 hours to open a can of beans, and he's telling it with this tone like this is some kind of funny and inspirational story. Haha! Parenthood, teachable moments, so on and so forth. Now, if you're thinking that this is apocalyptically stupid, that's because it is. So this gets some attention, and people immediately come out of the woodwork to start accusing Roderick of all sorts of crazy things, saying that he deprives his daughter of food, that he's setting her up for a lifetime of psychological baggage over a can of beans, and a really transparent attempt to go viral, which he did get what he wanted in some kind of backwards monkey's paw kind of way. But he made the biggest mistake he could have, second only to posting cringe. He engaged, he provoked people. They dig up old tweets of his from like 2011 or so, which predictably include inflammatory jokes and slurs, and he tweets something to the effect of whatever before deleting his account. And what's really weird is that this totally banal event had actual consequences. Roderick wrote the intro music to the My Brother and Me podcast, and now that's being pulled from the show. He also co-hosted a podcast with prolific Jeopardy champion Ken Jennings, who is being considered to replace Alex Trebek. Well, Jennings hops on Twitter, defends him, and now that might not happen, which is honestly for the best. He doesn't have Alex's charisma, or really any charisma at all. I'd rather see someone like Austin Rogers host, but that's just a personal preference. I'm digressing. Either way, it's a lot of fallout over a can of beans. When something happens at this scale, there's usually a lot of conversation around the bigger meaning of it. And there really shouldn't be one. It's a blatant attention grab that's centered around a can of beans. It is so self-evidently ridiculous. At its core, it is just total nonsense. But in this particular case, a lot of people, mostly Twitter blue checks, are discussing, what the internet is doing to us. And I'm no exception to this. I will admit there are some interesting philosophical questions raised by how we respond to the Twitter beef of the day. But for me, the conclusion to draw from this is a pretty simple one. Your website's poorly run, and that's it. So I know that saying Twitter is a bad website isn't exactly contributing anything to the dialogue. In fact, most Twitter users seem to kinda hate it. But something like this can only happen and garner as much attention as it did on a badly run platform. Obviously, your trending algorithm is noxious dumpster juice if something as stupid as this can generate as much discussion on your platform as Trump's Georgia call. You've also got a user base that's, one, desperate enough to consider writing a 23-tweet long thread about a can of beans, but also vicious and bored enough to turn this into a scandal. This is all a result of Twitter functioning exactly how it's meant to. The engagement metrics of the site, which are public, turn the website into a game of sorts. So everything that gets popular is perceived as being done for clout, even if it isn't attention that that person asked for. Like, don't get me wrong, this is exactly what happened here. Make no mistake about that. But that's not the case for every daily main character. The trending algorithm is so broken that any stupid thing that gets enough engagement is just beamed to every computer on Earth. Twitter mobs have taken the role of actual moderation for their sense of safety, but honestly, for their entertainment. And while the verified class does have special privileges that come through account verification, those identities online are tied to their offline ones as well. So you can cancel a journalist, and that's one thing, but if you're going after someone whose online moniker is exclusively like Nerd Hater 420, and this person is espousing actual hate speech, it's a totally different story, even if the latter is a more productive battle. But regardless, Bean Dad, in essence, is just how Twitter works. So the burning question here is whether or not I think this stuff is going to lead to the decline of Twitter, whether it be the user base or the profitability, but I honestly don't think that's going to be a case, at least not for a while. If you look at the way internet culture works, you see things coming from a small handful of the same websites, whether they be screenshotted and shared on another platform or aggregated by BuzzFeed or some similar clickbait brand. It's all coming from like 6 places, give or take. And Twitter is definitely one of the bigger ones of that. I also didn't really touch on it in this video, but I don't think it's coincidental that a lot of Twitter's users migrated there from Tumblr, and the way a lot of the drama plays out very closely resembles how it did on old Tumblr, but I feel like that's probably a different video for a different day, as not to get too off topic here. But at the end of the day, regardless of anything I've said here, I still do think the website is dying, even if it lasts another decade, even if it continues to grow its user base, even if like it continues to drive culture, unless there's some major intervention in like the structure and moderation of the site, it's just gonna get denser and more difficult to figure out what exactly is going on there. It's not gonna get better, like, at all. So Bean Dad is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's only worse from here on out. I'm personally just very interested to see what that ends up meaning. Anyway, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Give it a like, subscribe if you're interested. Obviously, I haven't uploaded anything on here before, as you can probably tell by how poorly edited this is and how awkward I am in front of a camera, but there is some more that I'd like to cover in video essay format, as well as some things that I mentioned here that I'd like to elaborate on. I'm kicking some scripts around and I'm locked down, so I don't really have anything better to do, and this is kind of fun. So if you're interested, please check it out. Thanks again so much, and on the flip side,